At 65, I had grown accustomed to solitude, though I had never quite made peace with it. My days followed a predictable rhythm, each moment mapped out like the well-worn corridors of the hospital where I had spent most of my career. Mornings started before dawn, with coffee brewed in a kitchen that had once held laughter but now sat quiet, the only sound the slow drip of the machine. I would read the newspaper out of habit rather than interest, skimming over headlines that rarely touched my world. For over 30 years, my life had been dedicated to caring for others. I had held hands through painful goodbyes, offered quiet reassurances in sterile rooms, and watched life begin and end within the same white walls. I had convinced myself that purpose was enough, that I needed nothing more than the steady presence of work to fill the emptiness. But lately, something had changed. The hospital halls felt longer, the quiet of my home heavier. I had built my world around my career, and now, as the years stretched on, I began to wonder if I had mistaken duty for fulfillment. The evening shifts were the hardest, the loneliness creeping in around the edges of exhaustion. I would walk home through the dimly lit streets of Willow Creek, the town I had never left, the town that had never quite felt like home. I told myself I was content, but the truth was harder to ignore with each passing day. Then, one evening, my routine was interrupted. Room 312 had a new patient, a younger man, mid-30s at most, with sharp features and a quiet intensity that seemed at odds with the sterile hospital environment. His arm was in a sling, and a faint bruise darkened the edge of his jaw. I glanced at his chart, Logan Calloway. No mention of family, just a note that he had been admitted after a motorcycle accident. There was nothing particularly unusual about him, yet the moment I stepped into the room, a shift occurred. He was awake, his gaze flicking toward me as I approached. I had met thousands of patients over the years, but there was something different in his eyes, an awareness, a quiet curiosity that unsettled me in a way I didn't understand. My professional smile slipped into place as I checked his vitals, the routine as familiar as breathing. I asked how he was feeling, expecting a perfunctory answer, but instead, he studied me for a long moment before responding, his voice rough from sleep. There was something about his tone, the way he spoke as if weighing his words carefully, that made the space between us feel smaller than it was. I moved through the standard procedures, focusing on the steady rhythm of my tasks, yet I was acutely aware of his presence. His pulse was strong beneath my fingers as I checked his wrist, his skin warm against mine. It was a brief moment, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, yet my heart stuttered in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. For the rest of the shift, I found my thoughts drifting back to him. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was something deeper, an unspoken recognition, a feeling I couldn't name. I had spent years keeping my emotions carefully contained, but for the first time in a long while, I felt something shift. That night, as I walked home, the air crisp against my skin, I realized that Logan Calloway was different. Not because of anything he had said or done, but because, in his presence, I had felt something stir within me. Something I had almost forgotten was there. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure if I wanted to push it away. The following days passed in a blur of routine, but I found my thoughts returning to room 312 more often than I cared to admit. Logan was recovering steadily, his strength returning with each passing day. I had been his nurse for less than a week, yet I found myself lingering in his room longer than necessary, adjusting his four with more care than was required, pausing before leaving as if waiting for something, though I couldn't quite define what. He was unlike the other patients I had cared for over the years. There was an ease to him, a quiet confidence that made his presence hard to ignore. I would find him sitting upright in bed, flipping through a book or staring out the window as if lost in thought. When he spoke, his voice was measured, carrying a depth that suggested he had lived more life than his years should have allowed. He spoke of places he had traveled, of the road trip he had been on before the accident, and with each story, I found myself drawn deeper into the sound of his voice, the way his lips curved slightly when he spoke of something he loved. At first, I told myself it was nothing. I was a professional, I had seen thousands of patients come and go. This was no different. And yet, when he smiled at me, something within me tightened, something long dormant stirred awake. I wasn't sure if I liked it. It had been years since I had thought of myself as anything more than my job, Years since I had considered what lay beyond the walls of the hospital. The way he looked at me, as if seeing more than just another nurse in scrubs, left me unsettled. I would catch his gaze lingering, a moment too long to be accidental, and a strange warmth would spread through me, leaving me breathless in a way that had nothing to do with age or exhaustion. I reminded myself of the rules I had lived by for decades, of the walls I had carefully built around my heart, but something about him made those barriers feel fragile. One evening, as I finished checking his vitals, he asked about me. Not in the casual, distracted way most patients did, but with a genuine curiosity, as if my existence beyond this hospital mattered. It had been so long since someone had asked, since someone had seemed to truly care. I found myself hesitating before answering, unsure of how much I wanted to reveal, how much of myself I was willing to offer. I told him little at first, just small pieces of my life, my years of service, my love for the town I had never left. He listened intently, his expression unreadable yet open, as though he was piecing together an image of me from the fragments I allowed him to see. I was used to being the one who listened, the one who held space for others, and yet, with him, the roles seemed to shift. As the days stretched on, the lines between professionalism and something more blurred in ways I hadn't expected. I knew I should have pulled back, should have reminded myself that this was temporary, that soon he would leave and this would be nothing but another fleeting moment. But when I entered his room, when his gaze met mine with that quiet intensity, I couldn't bring myself to step away. I was afraid of what I was beginning to feel, of what this might mean. And yet, I couldn't ignore it. There was something undeniable in the way his presence lingered with me long after I had left the hospital, in the way his voice echoed in my mind during the quiet hours of the night. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew the truth. Logan Calloway had awakened something in me, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. One evening, as I walked home after my shift, I found myself slowing my pace, stretching the journey longer than necessary. The glow of the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and I welcomed the solitude of the night air. My mind drifted to Logan, how his hands moved when he spoke, the way his voice carried a quiet warmth that settled into the spaces I hadn't realized were empty. I paused at a small cafe that had been a staple in town for years but had never truly drawn my attention before. Tonight, however, I felt compelled to step inside, to linger over something other than hospital paperwork and unanswered questions. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee enveloped me as I sat at a corner table, staring absently at the rain that had begun to mist against the windows. As I sipped my drink, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth I had been avoiding. It wasn't just that Logan was different, it was that he made me feel different. He had brought an awareness, a stirring of something long buried beneath years of self-imposed solitude. I could deny it no longer. I was drawn to him, to the possibility of something outside the confines of what I had come to accept as my life. And for the first time in years, I wondered if it was possible to want more. The days that followed were filled with restless energy, an anticipation I couldn't quite place. Logan had settled into his recovery, growing stronger with each passing day, yet with every conversation, every glance that lingered too long, I felt something else building beneath the surface. It was a quiet tug, a curiosity I couldn't shake. One evening, after finishing my shift, I found myself holding my phone longer than usual, my fingers hovering over the screen. The number had been stored there for days, ever since I had given in to impulse and asked for it under the guise of checking on his recovery. It was an excuse, one I barely believed myself, but it had been enough to justify it at the time. Now, it felt like an invitation waiting to be accepted or ignored. After minutes of indecision, I pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, before his voice filled my ear, warm and familiar despite the setting being so different from the hospital. I told myself to keep it brief, to keep my tone professional, but somehow, the words came out softer than I intended. We exchanged pleasantries, but when I finally asked if he wanted to meet for coffee, my heartbeat quickened. There was a pause, just long enough for doubt to creep in, but then he agreed, and something inside me settled. The cafe was a small, quiet place nestled between old brick buildings, the kind of spot I had walked past 100 times but never thought to enter. That night, however, it felt like the perfect meeting ground, a space separate from the fluorescent lights and sterile walls of the hospital, a place where I could exist outside of my role as a nurse. I arrived early, too nervous to linger at home, and chose a table near the window where I could watch the streetlights flicker to life. When he arrived, there was no hesitation in his steps, no awkwardness in his demeanor. He carried himself with the same quiet confidence that had first caught my attention. As he sat down across from me, I realized how different he looked outside of a hospital gown, more at ease, more like himself. The dim lighting of the cafe cast shadows along his jawline, highlighting the features I had only observed in brief stolen moments before. We spoke about simple things at first, how he had spent his time since being discharged, how strange it felt to be back in the world after days confined to a hospital bed. I found myself talking more than I expected, revealing small pieces of my life I hadn't shared in years. He listened with an attentiveness that unsettled me, as if he wasn't just hearing my words but truly absorbing them. The conversation stretched on, the space between us narrowing with every exchanged story, every shared smile. I was aware of the way he leaned in slightly when I spoke, the way his fingers tapped idly against his coffee cup as if to keep himself from reaching for something unseen. I was used to feeling invisible, to blending into the background of my own life, but in that moment, with his eyes locked onto mine, I felt undeniably seen. Hours passed without my realizing it, the cafe growing quieter as the evening wore on. When it was finally time to leave, I hesitated, reluctant to break whatever had formed between us in that small, dimly lit space. As we stepped outside, the chill of the night air wrapped around us, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't want to say goodbye. The days following our meeting at the cafe were filled with a strange, quiet warmth. I carried the memory of our conversation with me like a secret, replaying the way he had looked at me, the sound of his voice, the way I had felt, as though I had stepped out of the routine of my own life, if only for a moment. Yet, I reminded myself that Logan was just passing through. He had places to go, a life beyond this town, and I was merely a pause in his journey. It was foolish to imagine otherwise. So I pushed those thoughts aside, buried them beneath the weight of my daily routine, convinced myself that what had happened was nothing more than a pleasant evening with a former patient. But fate had other plans. A week later, while making my rounds at the hospital, I saw him again. He wasn't alone this time. Beside him, a young woman sat in one of the waiting room chairs, her face pale, her hands clasped in her lap. The sight of him, so suddenly and so unexpectedly, sent a jolt through me. For a brief, irrational moment, I thought she might be his girlfriend. The thought tightened something in my chest before I could reason my way through it. But as I approached, Logan caught my gaze and offered a small, weary smile. His sister, Emma, had fallen ill suddenly, and he had brought her in for tests. Relief flooded through me, irrational but undeniable. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, slipping back into the professional composure that had become second nature to me. I spoke to Emma, reassured her, went through the motions of my job with practiced ease. But I was acutely aware of Logan watching me, of the quiet gratitude in his eyes. I told myself that was all it was, gratitude. But as I moved through the hospital that day, I felt the shift again, the blurring of lines I had been so careful to maintain. He lingered in the hall after Emma was taken in for tests, standing just close enough that I could feel the weight of his presence. He thanked me, his voice low, sincere, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though the world had narrowed down to just the two of us. I wanted to say something more, something beyond the usual reassurances. But before I could, the moment passed, the spell broken by the sound of a doctor calling his name. He turned, and I watched him go, my heart caught between what had been and what might never be. The tension that had been simmering between us was undeniable now. It followed me through the halls of the hospital, lingered in my thoughts long after my shift ended. I told myself that it was fleeting, a product of circumstance, but each time our eyes met, the awareness deepened. The boundaries I had so carefully upheld felt increasingly fragile, thin as thread and just as breakable. Days passed, and Emma was discharged, leaving Logan free to continue his journey. Yet, he hadn't left town. I saw him once or twice, at the cafe, walking along the river's edge, as if he, too, was waiting for something unspoken. Or perhaps, like me, he wasn't ready to let go of whatever it was that had begun to form between us. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I arrived home to find a message waiting for me. Logan. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that sent my heart racing. Would love to see you. No hospital. Just us. I hesitated only briefly before responding, knowing full well that whatever we had both been holding back would no longer be ignored. We met at my house that night. The air between us crackled with unspoken anticipation as I led him inside, offering him something to drink, though neither of us were truly focused on such small gestures. It was as though we had been circling this moment for weeks, and now, here we were, on the precipice of something we could no longer deny. He stood close, his presence filling the space between us. There was no rush, no sudden urgency, just the quiet pull of two people acknowledging what had always been there. His fingers brushed against my wrist, a simple touch that sent a slow, steady warmth spiraling through me. My breath caught, but I didn't pull away. I wasn't sure who moved first, but soon his lips were on mine, tentative at first, then deepening as the last of our hesitations faded. It had been years since I had allowed myself this, since I had let someone in beyond the walls I had built around myself. And yet, with him, it felt effortless, like slipping into a rhythm I had once known but had long forgotten. Time became fluid. The soft glow of the lamp cast shadows along the walls as we moved, learning each other in a way that was both new and achingly familiar. His hands skimmed the curve of my waist, lingering as though memorizing the shape of me. Every touch, every whispered breath, spoke of longing that neither of us had dared to voice aloud. We didn't rush. There was something sacred in the way we took our time, savoring each moment as though it might slip through our fingers too soon. The outside world fell away, leaving only the warmth of his skin against mine, the steady beat of our hearts in perfect synchrony. And when the night gave way to the early hours of morning, we lay in the quiet, wrapped in the kind of stillness that felt more like contentment than silence. He traced patterns along my arm, his touch feather-light, as if reluctant to let the moment go. I never expected this, I admitted softly, staring at the ceiling, my fingers intertwined with his. His lips pressed a gentle kiss to my shoulder before he spoke. Neither did I. We both knew reality would return soon enough, that our lives remained separate in ways neither of us could change. But for now, in this moment, none of that mattered. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to just be without hesitation, without fear, without the need to hold back.